Well, folks, let's go ahead and gather together for our forum conversation. And so if you'll come on in from the lobby, Lloyd, if you can bring people in, that'd be great. Lovely to have Dwight and Patty back with us from your wonderful trip. Carla and I enjoyed our 2 years in Scotland. Sarah was a year and a half old to 3.5 when we went over there. And now our granddaughter, Ruby Lee Robinson, is with Carla over in the lounge, I think, about the same age as Sarah when we went over to Glasgow. So it just brings back great memories, and also taking people to George Fox country and that kind of thing. Well, we're glad to have Jason Lepojärvi here. And Jason, you're from Finland, is that correct? And then from Canada, and also time doing research in Oxford. So a truly international colleague who is now in his second year at George Fox University. Jason had come, and come on close to the front so we can have conversation. Jason had come to George Fox a couple of times in the last 5 or 6 years and lectured on C.S. Lewis and other themes. So we're so delighted that he is now the C.S. Lewis Associate Professor of Theology and Literature. And so great to have him with us. And one of the things that Jason is doing, and I'll ask Jason to say a little bit more about this in just a little bit, is that Jason has organized a conference, a C.S. Lewis conference is going to happen next September. And so he's also organizing a C.S. Lewis gathering in the Portland area, one of the oldest C.S. Lewis conferences or seminars, as well as one in Newburgh. So it's really great to have him pushing that emphasis as C.S. Lewis was engaging Christianity and culture in ways that have been hugely impactful over the last century or so. Delighted that his 2 kids are here, Kalefi and Evelyn. And good, Evelyn, good to have you with us. And I think Kalefi and others are with Carla. Hello, Kalefi, good to see you. And Carla is down at the lounge. If any kids want to go down there, you're certainly welcome to go down there. Well, in asking Jason to speak for us here and to lead us in some conversation, I told him that our theme this fall is be curious, not judgmental. And so Jason is applying that to C.S. Lewis and his work with the topic, Be Curious, Not Judgmental, C.S. Lewis on How Not to Read Fiction, Christian or Otherwise. So Jason, great to have you with us, and welcome to Reedwood.
Thanks for that introduction. And for the invite. My background is in Pentecostalism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, but now I'm worshiping in a Quaker church in Newburgh, as the saying goes, when in Newburgh, go Quaker. Do we have the slides? Oh, wrong one. Let me see if I can change. Yep.
It's usually the lower, what's I see, presenter view.
No.
Go back to the main screen. Usually I click this one right there.
This one?
Yeah, see if that works. Oh, I don't know why. There you go.
Ta-da! Well, since Paul so very kindly plugged in the conference that I'm organizing, I thought I'd mention more about it. You're all very welcome to join us next September. Next September at the George Fox University, a conference called the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis Conference. We'll have about 250, 300 people there, 6 keynote lectures, 2 from Oxford. We'll have 100 short papers, theatrical productions. A British actor, David Payne, will give his one-man show, An Evening with C.S. Lewis, which I've seen before. It's wonderful. There'll be a pre-screening of a brand new documentary on the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis. And registration opened just yesterday, so take advantage of the early bird discount that's there. I hope to see you there. Yeah, I'm Jason Lepojärvi, and the name is indeed a hybrid of British Canadian and Finnish Laplandish roots. My father was born in Finland, I was born in Lapland, my mother was born in British Columbia. I've traveled the world, lived in Germany, England, Tanzania, Canada, Finland, and now the US. This is my second year, so I think your second year is called your sophomore year. I'm a sophomore at George Fox. I take it that many of you know about C.S. Lewis's work, his apologetics, his fiction like Narnia, but he was actually a professor of English, and that's what he did. He wrote Narnia and his Mere Christianities during his free time, but during his bread and butter was English literature and criticism. In the 30s, he was involved in this literary dispute with a fellow English scholar from Cambridge called E.M. W. Tilliard. And so Lewis was a scholar of English in Oxford, and Tilliard was a scholar in Cambridge, and anyone who knows anything about higher education in England knows that this was a real controversy. You've got Cambridge versus Oxford, the arch enemies here. But although they named the book eventually The Personal Heresy, it wasn't really a heresy. They were very gentlemanly and charitable in this disagreement. Now, the name of this heresy, or fallacy, we can use these interchangeably, was first coined by Lewis in his opening letter. So the two scholars, they took turns writing letters, long letters to each other, 3 apiece, over the course of 3 years or so, and then it was published in a book. The name was, the disagreement or the heresy was coined by Lewis in his opening letter, which ends with this dramatic invitation to be free of the personal heresy. I take it you have the handout. If not, I have extra copies, but there's a couple of choice quotes there that I chose. Be free of the personal heresy. Now, what was this disagreement about between the two gentlemen? Well, in Lewis's words, the personal heresy is the claim, which he's taken from Tilliard, that all poetry is about the poet's state of mind, or as he says elsewhere, that the assumption that the writer's psychological state always flows unimpeded and undisguised into the product. This is the personal heresy, and Lewis calls it a serious error. A couple of Lewis scholars from Wheaton College, they say the problem with this personal heresy is that it takes the reader's attention away from the text to focus on the author instead. And most scholars, but not all, they would score the disagreement in Lewis's favor. If you're interested, you can read it for yourself. I'll pass this along. I'm not going to pass a judgment, but I brought in a couple of other books that you may not have seen, because most of us are familiar with Lewis's apologetics, but not as literary criticism. So I brought 2 books that I found in dingy bookshops in Oxford. This is C.S. Lewis's The Allegory of Love. This is his first scholarly book, kind of his PhD dissertation, if you will, although they didn't call it that. And this made him a big name in English literature. This, on the other hand, is the first edition of a book from 1954, which is the English literature in the 16th century. Lewis wrote this over the course of like 10, 12 years. And it was part of a series called Oxford History of English Literature, OHEL, or Oh Hell, as Lewis called it in his letters, because it kept nagging at him. It took him 10 years to write. So I'll pass these around. Okay, look at Oh Hell, and the allegory of love, and the personal heresy. Well, here I'd like to distinguish between two kinds of literature, however porously. So Lewis and Tilliard, they're talking about poetry. But it's clear that they think that this disagreement is much more than about poetry. It's about what they say, it's about all imaginative literature. In Lewis's mind, imaginative literature includes all fiction, poems, plays, stories, and whatnot. He explains that the most characteristic contents of this sort of imaginative literature are stories, accounts of events that didn't take place. Now, imaginative literature, in his view, is not important. It's not valuable for any impressions about the author's personality, however we define personality. Tilliard thought that it was. You've got this work of fiction, now let's use it to understand the author's personality. And Lewis is saying that no, that's not primarily how you read fiction. And in fact, that can be sometimes dangerous. This is imaginative literature. Now, the second type of literature we may call biographical literature. This kind of literature, Lewis thinks, is important and valuable for impressions about the author. And he says he calls them truly personal writings. Like biographical literature consists of private letters, essays, biographies, memoirs, all that kind of thing. Things that fall under the category historical data. That's a safer bet for impressions about the author's opinions or personality. Okay, so with these preliminary thoughts in place, now I'd like to define or outline for you a related but distinct form of misreading, which is kind of the main theme of my talk today, relating to be curious, not judgmental. Lewis goes far in describing this kind of misreading in various sources, but he never names it and never gives it, he never defines it. I like to call it the personal opinion fallacy. What Lewis had called the personal heresy and what I call the personal opinion fallacy, I propose they are two species of the same genus. They both fall under the category, the larger category of what could be called autobiographical fallacies. Now, autobiographical fallacies are forms of misreading that treat fiction as sources of knowledge in a wrong or incomplete way. They confuse life with art somehow. The personal heresy, the content of their disagreement, Lewis's disagreement with his colleague, uses imaginative literature primarily as raw material for clues about the author's personality. And perhaps it should have been called the personality heresy to make this clear instead of just the personal heresy. An example of this is when Lewis speaks of the assumed and usually concealed premise that the cynicism or disillusionment put into the mouths of some Shakespearean characters are Shakespeare's own. So because that Shakespeare's character is cynical, Shakespeare is cynical. It's sometimes asked, Lewis continues, whether Shakespeare was like this or that of his characters in his plays. And he replies, I don't know the answer. Why not? Well, I'll get to that. The personal opinion fallacy, on the other hand, concerns the author's opinions about life, about theology, about God, about anything. Personal opinions, not their personality, not the kind of person they are, or their temperament, or their mentality or emotions. This is a parallel form of misreading, of gleaning biography from fiction in a somewhat deficient way. And in its crudest, its silliest form, the personal opinion fallacy says, in effect, this. It says, because the story's character says this or that, or the plot, or the atmosphere, or the passage in this book suggests this or that, the author must personally also think this or that. This is a disastrous interpretative premise that can lead to right conclusions about the author's opinions only by accident. And yet, readers, even us Christians, we commit it all the time. I think including myself when I drop the guard. Now, fiction, Lewis wrote 40-odd books in his lifetime. What have you been doing with your life? Fiction, this is just a sampling of what he wrote. Fiction is vulnerable to this personal opinion fallacy by its very nature. And I mean that because most imaginative literature in the world is storytelling, and much of storytelling includes dialogue, sharing of utterances, including opinions, it's no wonder that we're then, as readers, drawn to consider these opinions that are expressed in fiction. Fiction is also vulnerable to this personal opinion fallacy because fiction is a mix of information, misinformation, and disinformation, or for the less technical words, of truth, mistakes, and lies. Lewis confessed that he had learnt from novels in particular a great deal of information, but also a plenty of misinformation. And that's the reason why he rarely read the news in newspapers, because he thought that they were just fabulous, like in the old sense of the word, fabrications. He didn't like journalists very much. He believed, in one letter he says, I believe journalists can go to heaven, but I don't understand why. Now, Lewis's own fiction is especially vulnerable to this personal opinion fallacy of thinking we see, of using it as primarily as material for getting Lewis's views on things. Now, why is this? It's because much of his writing, whether it's on theology or criticism or fiction or alike, emerge from his pen as not as distinct categories, but as themselves mixed genres. They're pretty mixed. And this is not a complaint. On the contrary, it's what a fellow Inklings member, so the literary group that Lewis belonged to in Oxford, fellow Inklings member Owen Barfield has called Lewis's presence of mind, which meant that somehow what Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything, and vice versa. So Lewis's work is especially vulnerable to this sort of misreading. Now, why should we avoid this personal opinion fallacy? So C.S. Lewis on how not to read fiction, and Christian or otherwise. Like, why avoid this personal opinion fallacy? Why should we, as readers of imaginative literature, of fiction and novels, and as Christians, why should we avoid it? Why should we care about it in the first place? Why bother at all? The first obvious reason is that when authors become targets of critics who mistake the views expressed by their character or their plot or their atmosphere for the views held by the author themselves, many authors begin censoring themselves. They begin self-censoring. They become timid. And this leads to reducing diversity of expression in fiction, of diluting diversity and vigor of expression. It's a serious malady. Besides this authorial self-censorship, another obvious reason why we should avoid it, I think, is because Very often we end up falsely attributing to the authors opinions that they perhaps never in reality share. And this is an injustice towards them, even if the opinions are good opinions, like politically correct ones, but especially if they're not. And it's important to notice that we make this mistake not only when we read the books of authors we dislike or we have a prejudice, but also authors we like. So both favoritism and prejudice can lead to this mistake. Lewis is speaking of all authors when he says that you can be blamed and praised for saying what you never said and for not saying what you have said. And undeserved approval is also a critical fault, he says, just as much as undeserved blame. Both are equally wrong as exegesis. But surely negative misreadings are morally worse, like when we attribute like negative opinions to the author, morally worse than positive ones. Lewis seems to disagree. He says that fatuous praise from a manifest fool may hurt more than any deprecation, which is odd. But I'm reminded of, for example, one of the few positive reviews to one of his books penned by an Anglican clergyman. In Lewis's private letter, he cites this review, this very favorable review, as a prime example of the favorable review which exasperates an author more than the most spiteful censure could do. He misunderstands so deeply. Now, this is mildly amusing and funny, but I think it's hyperbolic. He's exaggerating. I would suggest that certainly for like normal mortal authors, negative misreadings are on average morally more problematic because of their possible ill effects, the damage they can do to an ordinary author's reputation or feelings or even their family livelihood. Praise culture is not a serious problem. Cancel culture is a serious problem. But it's also a problem for the critics or the readers or the canceller's own heart. So it's better to err. If you're going to make a mistake, make a mistake in charity. We should avoid the personal opinion fallacy because we care about justice. We want to be good people. But we also want to be good readers. So no true lover of fiction often commits this fallacy. When we do commit this fallacy, we often end up revealing something about us, not about the author. We might betray our own prejudice and biases, which we then project onto the authors. So it damages imaginative literature, and it damages our moral imagination when we do this. Well, the last reason why to avoid this fallacy is because it's a disfavor to scholarship. It's a colossal loss of academic energy, and I know there are some former professors among you, and even present professors. Like when we blaze false trails, it sometimes takes decades to correct, or generations to correct. Lewis says that in literary criticism, ideas still circulate from one critic to another, which have obviously not been verified by actual reading. And this, of course, applies to other disciplines as well, not just English literature. Okay, so much for what the personal fallacy is, and for some reasons why we should try to avoid it as readers, as Christians, as scholars even. I'll next turn to how we can avoid it. Now, hints about the correction to the fallacy, or the literary antibody to the virus, as I like to say sometimes, have been dropped throughout these reflections, but I think it helps to spell it out and perhaps even give it a name. You remember the question earlier about whether Shakespeare, or think of any other author of fiction, whether Shakespeare was like this or that of his characters. And Lewis has said that he didn't know the answer to that. Why not? Well, because, he explains, To decide that question, we must start with investigating historical data and moral principles. In other words, we must turn from imaginative literature to what we've called biographical literature. We must ground our biographical speculations in biographical literature. Let actual history tether theory. The principle of biographical verification, as I like to call it, but please help me think of a sexier name for it. It's a very clumsy name. This is a humiliatingly effective curative to the personal opinion fallacy, but also to many other forms of bad reading. An analogy might help to understand what I mean by it and what I mean by the problem. Imagine a black and white painting on the wall. This represents an imaginative literary artifact, like a book of fiction, for example. You see several hearts there, both in black and white, and both of these colors represent opinions. But only one, so only black or white, represents the opinions of the author. The other represents the opinions or corresponds to the opinions that you find in the book, but may not be the author's personal opinions. Now, if I were to ask you which is which color is which, you couldn't answer me, could you? You couldn't. You'd be guessing. Now, why is that? You couldn't answer because you lack contrast. You lack a backdrop against which you could then evaluate the content and sift through the two kinds of opinions. In short, you lack what we've called biographical literature. Here, biographical literature is the wall. Once you place that literary item and you hang it on the wall representing biographical literature, once you do your homework, once you read essays and letters and memoirs and biographies and so on, which are represented by the wall here, on which this painting hangs, then you'll be in a much better position to sift through the personal opinions of the author and the fictional opinions. So in this analogy, black would be personal opinions. Anything black in the painting corresponds to the author's personal opinions. You might even start to see shades of gray. If you're a Lewis reader, or a reader of any other author of fiction, but in this example, a Lewis reader, do you want to know what theory of atonement, so of salvation, Lewis ascribes to? We just heard Irv talk about sanctification and justification. Do you want to know what C.S. Lewis thought about justification and sanctification? Well, you should put down your copy of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you remember Aslan's sacrifice there. Put that down for a while, even despite Aslan's sacrifice, and pick up Mere Christianity, which is more openly biographical and where he shares his opinions in a more straightforward manner. Do you want to know what Lewis thought about teenage girls, about budding female sexuality? I don't know if you want to know about that, but say you did want to know about that. Well, you should put aside for a moment the last of the Chronicles, the last battle, even though there's this teenage girl there who doesn't make it to Narnia. And pick up his pre-conversion diary, the diary he kept before he was a Christian, for his immature views about women, or some of his older letters after his conversion for his more mature views of women, and so on. And then you can return to fiction and read the Narnia, read other books of fiction by Lewis, with less of a risk of reading too much into it and making these mistakes. Critical judgment is really difficult for ordinary readers and even trained readers, and this should instill in us humility and moderation. Two American scholars of Lewis ask, how can we be confident that we have understood the motives and the intentions of others? This is a great question. Charles Williams, who was also a member of the Inklings, the Oxford-based literary group called the Inklings, he made a living by reviewing books, many of them really bad books, at a pace faster than I can read them. And he says, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what its opponent says, much less what he thinks. So we should be this is very humble in my opinion. The more significant and the sensitive the questions are, the values are that we're speculating about, the more unwise it's forgetting the principle of biographical verification. A responsible reader, a responsible Christian, a responsible educator wouldn't too hastily draw any conclusions about an author's view on such themes as like sex or religion or race and so on. But to speculate about lesser important things like favorite color or favorite sport is less dubious. We don't want to become these boring heresy hunters of the latest taboo and sin who are so eager to catch authors off their guard that they only drop their own guard. A recent perfect example of this is the way J.K. Rowling, if you've followed the news, J.K. Rowling's feminist views on transgenderism led some activists to attack her latest mystery novel called Troubled Blood on the grounds that her quote-unquote transphobia was on full display because the villain in the story sometimes dressed as a woman to lull his victims into a state of complacency. A rather common murder mystery trope, how does the murderer empower his victims, was then misread as a sign of the author's other beliefs. Or for another example, one critic of Lewis cites the exchange in the book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There's an exchange between Prince Caspian and Lucy about a girl who squints and has freckles, and cites this exchange, this dialogue, as an example of Lewis's smug and snide disparagement of girls. This person not only falls into this trap of equating characters' views with authorial views, but he also mistakenly extrapolates from the particular to the general. And he would have benefited from reading Lewis's letter to a young admirer almost 70 years ago this day. Lewis wrote to this little boy that, I don't dislike panthers at all. I think they are one of the loveliest animals there are. But I don't remember that I have put any bad panthers in the books. There are some good ones fighting against Rabadash in The Horse and His Boy, aren't there? But even if I had, that wouldn't mean that I thought all panthers bad, any more than I think all men bad, because of Uncle Andrew, a rotten character in the stories, or all boys bad, because Edmund was once a traitor. Pretty simple. This picture, by the way, I got the permission of the Wade Center in Wheaton College to use it. It shows the young Lewis. He's in his 20s here. He's a pretty handsome chap, isn't he? He would have been much older during the controversy, the personal heresy, let alone later. But I thought I'd use this because it's such a rare photo, and you may have never seen it, even if you have seen a picture of Lewis. I began these reflections with a brief overview of the personal heresy between Lewis and his fellow English scholar Tilliard. And I proposed a loose distinction between what I called imaginative literature and biographical literature. I introduced a related but distinct form of literary misreading, which I call the personal opinion fallacy. This is not being curious, this is being judgmental. And I discussed reason why fiction, as a genre of literature in particular, is vulnerable to this fallacy. And then I also suggested some reasons why we should try to avoid making this mistake. Finally, that principle of biographical verification would help steer us away from seeing too much in literary works of imagination, help us become more responsible readers. Now, before I conclude, I just want to guard against three possible misunderstandings of my argument. First, I'm not saying that imaginative literature, let alone Lewis's fiction, is free from personal opinions. Of course it's not. Fiction is often replete, full of them. Certainly, something of the author's personality and opinions may be in evidence in whatever they've created. I doubt that anyone disagrees with that. In one of Lewis's short pieces, which he published in the New York Times in the 50s, the piece was called "Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said," and it was a response and his attempt to answer the question, why did I write the Chronicles of Narnia? He admits that part of his motive or intention in writing the Chronicles of Narnia was to smuggle in theology, or more precisely, smuggle or give readers a taste or have them experience the power or the reality behind these doctrines, behind teachings that have gone flat. So you might have heard about forgiveness, but you've never experienced it. Perhaps through fiction you could get a taste of what it feels like. You might have heard about God's love, but you may not actually know what it means. Maybe through encountering Aslan, you might understand it better. So this is what he meant when he said he wanted to smuggle in theology. My claim isn't that writers never try to educate or influence their readers. Of course they do. Secondly, I didn't want to suggest that interpreting biographical literature is easy either. It's not, and interpreting and reading biographical literature is difficult for much of the same reasons. You can't take it at face value, as you know. Authors misremember things. They change their mind during their lives. They dramatize. They conceal. Sometimes they even lie. But all that, this is a problem that belongs to a different set of literary problems. And then finally, to guard against a third possible misunderstanding, I'm not saying that psychological theories are unhelpful in trying to interpret an author's life or letters. There are several examples of good, more responsible, more careful ways of trying to glean biography from fiction, or I should say, in conjunction with fiction, back and forth between imaginative and biographical literature. Even when there's nothing in the biographical literature that explicitly demonstrates or supports what we think we see in their fiction, we might just be right, actually, however improbable. But proving this is another matter, and it's full of dangers. A great example of this sort of good psychological interpretation of fiction is perhaps this one Christian therapist, a psychotherapist, Stephen Logan's essay called "The Soul of C.S. Lewis," because it's so daring and yet so responsible, and it so well illustrates some of the things we've been talking about. So Stephen Logan, he proposes a theory that can't be evaluated on the present historical data. And the theory is this, that Lewis may have found his relationship with his mother disappointing to him, but that Lewis possibly remained unconscious of this disappointment personally. Did he feel securely and lovingly held by his mother? Logan asks. Was he welcomed into the world? These are terrific questions. But how on earth would we evaluate them? Even Logan, who's a professional psychiatrist, sends us to biography. He says, we would need to know a lot more about Flora Hamilton, Lewis's mother, and her feelings towards her son in order to be able even to speculate with any confidence. And I close with Tolkien, the last of the Inklings members. I mentioned Lewis, I mentioned Owen Barfield, I mentioned Charles Williams, who reviewed these bad books. Tolkien was the second most famous, or maybe even more famous than Lewis, Inklings member. And I want to end with him because I think he exhibits a similar kind of literary maturity that this Christian psychotherapist exhibits. After Tolkien's wife's Edith's death, Tolkien wrote a beautiful letter to his youngest son, Christopher, who had asked his father about the inscription Tolkien had chosen for Edith's tombstone in Oxford. And the inscription had said Luthien, which is the name of the central heroine from Tolkien's invented mythology. This is how Tolkien, the father, responds to his son. Your mother was, and she knew she was, my Luthien. I will say no more now, but I should like ere long to have a long talk with you. For if, as seems probable, I shall never write any ordered biography, it is against my nature, which expresses itself about things deepest felt in tales and myths. Someone close in heart to me should know something about things that records do not record. I just love that. Records do not record. So Tolkien's tales and myths are pregnant, so to speak, with things deepest felt. There's a lot of Tolkien's own feelings and thoughts in his mythology. But to safeguard this real history and to avoid future misunderstandings, he wants to, what does he want to do? He wants to talk with his son. Why? So that other, more biographical records might record what was imaginatively recorded in myth and tale. So that's Tolkien. Well, there ends my lecture, if you want to call it that. Do we have time for discussion? I gave this talk at a Christian educators conference last week at George Fox. We hosted 250 Christian educators from around Oregon. And my wife and my other daughter, they're traveling. They've been gone for 2 weeks in Finland. And so I bring my other two associates with me to my classes. And so they were sitting in the front row there. And 3/3 into my talk, Kalevi, my son, interrupts me and says, "Daddy," and I stop my lecture and I say, "Just excuse me, my assistant wants to say something." I say, "Yes, Kalevi, I'm bored." We all started laughing. I laughed the hardest, but the poor boy thought we were laughing at him and started crying, buried his face in his hoodie. So I went down to comfort him and I said, "Oh, baby, we're not laughing at you." He said, "What are you laughing at then?" "At Daddy." No, yes, a true student who had no unhealthy reverence towards his professors.
And my question is, would you say that C.S. Lewis is a conservative evangelical Christian?
Would I say that C.S. Lewis is a conservative evangelical Christian?
I know a lot of evangelicals consider him so, and I've always seen him more as a high church Anglican.
That's a very good question. There are certain circles that treat Lewis as a saint. There's a Saint Lewis who doesn't err, infallible Lewis, who's always right. He's remarkably right, but even Lewis has his theological blind spots. In today's contemporary language, I suppose you could describe him as conservative, certainly. Evangelical, I have no idea what that means. I don't know if anyone does. He himself wasn't too high Anglican. He was in the sense that he didn't, for example, some high Anglicans, they venerate Mary and the saints. They have no problem with that, and Lewis didn't. However, towards the end of his life, he became increasingly confident that we can pray for our dead loved ones, that we can pray for their souls. And that's not very evangelical. So he believed in purgatory. That's closer to Catholicism than Protestantism. And he adopted some spiritual disciplines like fasting from meat on Fridays and private confession that aren't typical in many Protestant or evangelical churches. So it's a complicated answer. It's hard to pigeonhole him in our modern categories. And he wanted to avoid that, hence books like Mere Christianity, where he wants to downplay his own denominational leanings and focus on things that he thinks unites Christians and that Christendom has shared. More like a bridge builder than a Christian, intra-Christian antagonist. He was an apologist to the non-Christian world, but it wasn't his vocation to convert anyone from Church A to Church B. He wanted to convert people to Christianity, and he used the analogy of this grand mansion where he wants to just lead them into that hallway, but from which doors open into specific rooms. But he says it's in the rooms where people have their meals and their fireplaces and smoke their pipe and do all lovely things, not in the hallway. So you can't stay in the hallway forever, Go into one of the rooms.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciate Lewis's pushing back against personalist guessing and trying to psychologize a text. On the other hand, even if we didn't have Lewis's Mere Christianity and his apologetics work, we might guess in his Narnia novels and writing that some of his theology does come through. So he is talking about values, he is talking about the world beyond what we can see. Doesn't he, in his own writing, maybe modify some of his criticism?
He doesn't say that. I don't think he says that. Well, I think I tried to answer that. That's a very good question. I tried to answer that in my first of the three answers at the very end, to guard against misunderstandings. So the first misunderstanding being that that authors never educate and that their opinions don't come through their fiction. That's not true. They often do come through their fiction. Fiction is replete with personal opinions as well. But interpreting that is really difficult sometimes. Sometimes, especially when we're talking about important opinions, so opinions that are either sensitive or they have dramatic, real life impacts. The point that Lewis is trying to make is that you have to be very modest in reading and interpreting this. And if you are using fiction, like Chronicles of Narnia, primarily as a way to, as source material to understand Lewis's theology, the most responsible thing to do is to lean more on the more straightforward biographical sources. If we know that the author has written something, theological books, more straightforward theological or philosophical books, or there's biographies or essays where he's very open about his opinions, make sure that you ground or you support your speculations leaning on those primarily. And that will make it less risky. It'll be less likely that you'll read too much into the fiction. It's not, even if you don't have mere Christianity, even if you don't have biographical literature, you can speculate about the author's opinions about theology using just imaginative literature as your primary sources. But you're on a lot shakier grounds there. And Lewis thinks that he says in some of his letters that he thinks that there's a close to 0% success rate when he's been reading reviews of his 40 books, whether they're theology or literary criticism or whatnot, and reviewers have made educated guesses about Lewis's views, personal views, that aren't very explicitly stated in the works. He says there's approximately 0% success rate. When he published his first spiritual autobiography called The Pilgrim's Regress, critics thought he had become a Catholic. Wrong. He hadn't, just as an example. When he published Mere Christianity even, Lewis tried to downplay his own opinions and just talk about what Christians all share. And reviewers made guesses about his own opinions. And Lewis says they were wrong. So it's really difficult sometimes. Like we can say, okay, I read the Chronicles of Narnia. I think the author, if I'm reading it correctly and Aslan represents Jesus, I think the author is saying that Aslan is a loving character who is willing to sacrifice for the well-being of others. That's a very general and a safe interpretation. But then when you get into the weeds of like theologians' disagreements about different atonement theories of how exactly that salvation takes place, then it becomes a lot more trickier if you only have the Chronicles of Narnia and you don't have his essays and other works.
Did or how did his marriage to Joy Davidman affect or influence his writings?
That's a very good question. Has anyone seen the movie Shadowlands? So, Shadowlands, there are two versions. The first one was a BBC £2 million movie from the 80s. And the second one was a $20 million movie from the 90s, a Hollywood version. And Joy Davidman's son, So Joy Davidman's son, Douglas Gresham, so Lewis's stepson, who is still alive, has said of that movie that Deborah Winger, the American actress, plays an excellent Joy, and Anthony Hopkins plays an excellent Anthony Hopkins. And he was trying to say that Douglas was trying to say that Lewis was not a super serious Oxford Don who, only after meeting this eccentric American poet, finds his feelings and is able to be vulnerable in love and so on. But Lewis was actually quite jovial, funny, loud, and so on. So Anthony Hopkins didn't quite capture the essence of Lewis. But that movie has led to the impression that meeting Joy really changed Lewis much more than it really did. So it is not clear to me that Lewis changed his opinions about anything, or that his writing style changed as a result. He did write his book on love, The Four Loves, after marrying Joy. And The Four Loves was published in 1960, a year before Joy died. Joy died in 60 or 61. And so many have seen Lewis, that his experience of marriage is visible in that book, especially in the chapter on eros, or romantic love. But having read what Lewis wrote and thought about eros before his marriage, I don't see any new thoughts. We do know that Joy helped Lewis to write books, like one of my favorite books by Lewis is called Till We Have Faces, which is set in a pre-Christian era, and the main character is Orwell, a queen, an ugly queen. And Lewis calls Joy his, in English, what do you call the lady who helps with, is it doula? Helps with a doula. Mm-hmm. So Joy helped Lewis give birth to this book. So Lewis would write a chapter, Joy would critique it, read it. And my mother, for example, said of that book that it's incredible how well Lewis understands the feminine psyche. Maybe Joy had a role in that.
Thank you, Jason. Great things to be thinking about. I'm following Dee's example here and giving the last question. Okay. Yeah, good point about challenging the objectivity of fiction in terms of biography and the authors and stuff. How about the subjectivity of biography? Wayne Booth wrote a book a long time ago on the rhetoric of fiction. How about the rhetoric of biography, or even the rhetoric of history, or goodness, nowadays, the rhetoric of news media? How do we even ascertain the truth of something which claims to be rooted in objective judgment, but might also be a projection of personal opinion?
Can you think of an easier question to end with? Well, this was the second of the three misunderstandings I wanted you to guard against that I unpacked at the very end. Like, yes, reading biography or so-called biographical sources is also tricky. It's because that also is a mixture of truth and mistakes and even lies. And Lewis was very, very aware of that. And it's quite clear that Lewis himself took some literary liberties when he wrote his Surprised by Joy, which Irv mentioned earlier, one of his spiritual autobiographies. Lewis even misremembers his conversion by a year. writing 30 years after the fact or 25 years after the fact. So a lot of mistakes do happen. Now, how do we know that he misremembers? It's because of scholarship. So the accumulation of knowledge and critical scholarship, biographical sources also have to be vetted. And one of the ways we do this through is critical scholarship. Over time, blind spots are exposed and these false trajectories are corrected. Also in biblical scholarship, I've heard that that happens from time to time. Believe it or not. Once a century, maybe. So there is no easy, I'd say there is no easy answer. It's really difficult. How do you know what's true? How do you know what's true on the news, on social media? Who checks the fact checkers? We've got the fact checkers, but who checks them? It's very difficult, and a lot of combined effort, critical effort and judgment is required over a period of time to get an accurate understanding of something.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Really appreciate it. Let's close in prayer. Irv, would you close us in prayer? Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Fantastic. Our forum class next week will be Paul Metzger of Multnomah Seminary. He'll be talking about persons are more than things, the subject of his latest book. So that'll be a great discussion as well. Thank you. Bert, are these being recorded, or are these being recorded? Yes, fantastic. Yeah, wonderful.
Oh, what does C.S. Lewis do? What he did was, he was a professor, like Daddy, but much better. And he wrote books and he taught. But he's been dead for a long time now. He's in heaven. His son is still alive. That's another historical inaccuracy of the Shadowlands movie. Joy had two sons, not one. Imagine being David, the son that was left out.